Hello, everyone. Let's kick this off. For those of you who can't recognize my voice, it's Charles Stankiewicz speaking. I'm the Director of Visual Studies here at the University of Toronto. And it's my pleasure to introduce the talk this evening and the speaker, Chris Lee. This is our second event for the MVS Proseminar of the academic year. Our first one was a more private event, invitational, as we did a 50th anniversary reading of Eden. Trying to balance this year as everything goes digital and online are events which are open to the public, like this one, where people can stream and drop in to ask questions from the public at large, and some more intimate workshops that are done with our graduate students and guests. So that's kind of our intention for the year. So Chris Lee is actually kicking off our first public event. For those of you who don't know, Chris Lee is a graphic designer and intellectual that I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years, and I've actually wanted to get Chris to come speak on our program for quite some time, or at least catch his lecture personally, selfishly, which hadn't happened, and so it just seemed like the easiest way to do it is actually to invite Chris to come give a talk back in Toronto. A little bit of a homecoming for him. He's in quarantine, I think, at the moment, if I'm allowed to say that or not. I guess we're all in quarantine virtually in a certain sense. And so it's great that he is able to join us. I want to quickly look at his bio or read his bio, but the longer one is online. Chris is a professor at Pratt Institute in New York. He's a graduate of OCAD University, so hence him coming back to Toronto, as I was saying. And has pretty much touched, I think, most artists within the city through his graphic design. I mean, almost everyone probably here has had a book or a catalog or an essay published in one shape or form that's been crafted through the skills of Chris. So I'm sure a lot of the people that are listening tonight are in that case. I've invited him to speak on a little bit carte blanche, and he gladly talked or suggested the topic of historiography and looking at graphic design through the ages and how to design for the ages. And he's also the designer of our lecture series graphics this year. And so it's great to kind of have someone who is practically engaging our faculty through the design and the professional aspect, and then come in and hit us with the intellectual as well. Now, I didn't require Chris to talk on the project that he was contracted for. I don't know if he'll mention it or not. I'm sure the separation between praxis and theory is not always that far for him. But the question tonight is to discuss these larger questions in regards to graphic design history. So it's with that, we'll have Chris speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. The lecture is being recorded today, so just want to let everyone know that. We're not sure if it's going to be posted online yet, but we're recording it at least as an archive. So please be aware of that in the chat and the questions that we are proceeding that way, just full disclosure. And with that, I will pass it over to Chris. So again, Chris, thank you so much for doing this, and really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Charles. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here and feel privileged to be able to share some of the work that I've been doing and things that I've been thinking about. As you said, I feel like graphic designers typically don't get asked to talk about their work. I enjoy mostly being behind the scenes. Or I don't know if I enjoy it. That's just my way of working. But so it's unusual, I savor the opportunity and look forward to any kind of discussion we might have on the ideas I'll present. So I'm just going to figure out how to, share screen. And this one, I think. Can everyone see a new image slide? Can you, or only one person has to indicate to me. I think it's visible. Okay, so I'll start. This talk is called Immutable. The subtitle of it is Redesigning Graphic Design Historiography. And then I added another part to that subtitle, which wasn't in the, promotion for this, which reads Towards a Critical Studio Pedagogy. So You get a little bit of a bonus, something you didn't expect. So this talk is ultimately concerned with graphic design pedagogy as a site of intervention in the inertia of what I tend to call graphic design's commercial, client-oriented, disciplinary imaginary, which by and large, I would say, fails to account for the ways in which graphic design has been entangled with colonialism and capitalism. So I'll just hit you with that up front. And maybe try to elaborate that dense little nugget there through this talk. The work that I'll share is aimed at articulating an antagonism towards what I see as this entanglement, again, between design, colonialism, and capitalism. What I'll do is I'll briefly sketch out what I mean by commercial client-oriented pedagogy by way of some language that's being used to promote undergraduate graphic design programs. I'll also outline some of the theoretical premises that I think figure through the genre of the document, graphic design's role as an instrument of capitalism and colonialism. I'll then walk you through some projects that I've developed under the rubric of a project called Immutable, which considers a counterposition to what I call the design imperative to publicity, which I don't go into in a lot of detail here, but maybe something we can discuss. But the design imperative to publicity, which I understand as being the sort of core of commercial client-oriented practice. And the counterposition that I'm identifying, I'll call the design imperative to immutability, which is framed by a graphic design historiography that centers the document, which, again, I'll elaborate, which is a thing in all its banality that is designed precisely to resist the entropy of movement through time, space, and to deflect doubt and contestation, or what I would refer to as the political, or how. So this is really a project to think about and reflect on the ways in which design works to depoliticize, to remove things from redefinition, from contestation or dispute. And here I'm thinking about the political, particularly as as being the condition of contestation or being contestable. Oops, forward. Okay, so my initial assertion is that the conventional graphic design, graphic design historiography reproduced in design programs the world over shapes the horizons of this stultifying commercial practice, or imaginary. And by imaginary, I mean, what as design students or prospective designers imagine their concerns to be, what their role in society might be, the range of things that they make or engaged with, and the values they hold. So in order to really attack this kind of design, I mark it with a label of, again, what I call the design imperative to publicity, which is itself premised on a teleological historiography of design's progressive march towards mass communication and a universalist imaginary founded on languages of form born of industrial, mechanical, and managerial rationality. And I'll elaborate on this shortly. This, to me, is exemplified in form factors typically taught in graphic design programs, right? Things like logos, campaigns, websites, books, posters, t-shirts, billboards, apps. Again, these are the sort of typical genres or form factors we teach in design school, in graphic design school, that that sort of are oriented towards this sort of imperative to publicity. So just a few examples of language from some more prominent design schools in the US and in Canada. So Rhode Island School of Design, graphic design graduates leave RISD prepared to work. This is some career outlook language from their websites. Leave RISD prepared to work in almost any field imaginable, from education to film, television, publishing, retail, and more. Alumni follow a wide range of individual paths, including running their own design studios, working for large corporations, specializing in web and interactive media, creating everything from package design to title sequences for film and television, publicity. You can pursue, this is OCADU in Toronto, my alma mater. You can pursue studio courses in areas of practice such as brand strategy, editorial, and publication design, which was my sort of specialization and background there. Interactive communications, motion graphics, packaging design, typeface design, wayfinding, and information systems. MICA in Baltimore, faculty who are leaders in design professions connect MICA students with outstanding opportunities for internships, freelance, and career launching jobs. Some companies who have hired MICA designers for jobs or internships include Abercrombie and Fitch, Cooper Hewitt, National Design Museum, Google, Kate Spade, etc. Otis College of Art and Design. Typical formats include branding and logo development, posters, books, package apps, websites, interactive design. You kind of get the idea. Excuse me. So I also want to sort of like describe this sort of imperative to publicity, thinking or looking at it through the lens of designs, graphic designs historiography. Most, if you don't know, I think most graphic design programs, at least in North America, use the Meg's History of Graphic Design as the textbook for well, the History of Graphic Design course that they teach. I've used this as a student, as an educator. I've used parts of this, and I've also used Johanna Drucker's book. I'll bring up Johanna Drucker later. But if you don't know, right, the Meg's history of graphic design, is understood to be quite a kind of teleological, kind of linear progressive narrative that sort of brings you from cave paintings to the internet. And at least when I was studying this book, I can't remember, I think it was the middle edition, maybe the 4th edition. There wasn't like a lot of, it was quite a Euro-centric, Euro-American-centric narrative. And I think over the years, it's become progressively more inclusive and global and diverse. But I mean, I would argue, and I don't go into this too much, but I would argue this sort of like diversification is actually more akin to tokenization. And I think one example of this is in an early section of the book where a section titled "The Cradle of Civilization," where in its opening sentences, Meg's makes a passing reference to the emergence of agricultural societies in what is now Thailand, and notes that they preceded the Mesopotamian developments, in terms of agricultural societies and writing, etc. But then without elaborating on the significance of this, the Thai precedent, moves immediately back to the Mesopotamian example, as if, right, this was, there was no significance to the Thai example. But my issue here is not so much that Meg's misses the opportunity to diversify the history that he's writing, but it's more that he treads a well-worn linear chronology of progressive development, and it's void of substantive insight. Only a few pages and a few thousand years later, he refers to Hammurabi's stele, right? This example, or one of maybe the earliest example of a codified system of laws. And oh, was that a question? Oh, just a glitch maybe. Right, he refers to Hammurabi's stele of code of laws and quote, writes that writing enabled society to stabilize itself under the rule of law and spelled out crimes and their punishments, establishing social order and justice, end quote. For me here, the conflation of law and justice is precisely the kind of thing that I find naive and problematic about Meg's book, right? The conflation of law and justice is belied, if one thinks about the institution or the legality of slavery throughout history, right? One immediately understands the flaw here. So again, this is sort of like progressive teleology that sort of tells a story about, advancement, almost as if it were kind of a natural fact, without much context, without much of a point of view, I would say. So again, my problem is not so much with, right, the lack of diversity. My problem with the graphic design historiography is this sort of like lack of context or a kind of critical point of view. And my intervention that I hope has some value is a proposition to recast design historiography with the document, this very broad genre of the document as its protagonist, or perhaps its anti-hero. Right, so rather than focusing on design historiography, which in turn I think informs, right, what students and educators think of being as being their vocation, rather than focusing on things like logos and apps and websites, what if, right, design historiography centered the document, which is exemplified by forms such as money, contracts, passports, receipts, property deeds, standards, and this kind of thing. Well, the first thing that I would ask then, right, would be, what is a document? And so I think about the document. I'm going to sort of outline how I'm thinking about the document through a handful of thinkers. The first being Lisa Gittleman, whose work has been very informative of my approach to the document, particularly through how she theorizes it in her book Paper Knowledge Toward a Media History of Documents. And for her, the document has two primary functions, what she calls the no-show function. So on the one hand, the document is a knowledge-producing artifact. And then on the other hand, the document serves an evidentiary role. And then a kind of tertiary effect of this is that the document triangulates the relationship between individuals and authority. And so I think a kind of really good example of the document that does these three things is the passport. The passport is a knowledge-producing document to the extent that it, right, inscribes certain attributes onto a kind of a subject, right? It interpolates the subjects in a way that it identifies, right? It sort of labels this a person with having a name, a birth date, a nationality, a gender, which is usually, if you're checking off boxes, you have a binary of options, birth date, etc. Right? So it sort of attributes these things to people, not because they are necessarily intrinsic to that person, but as a matter of the governance of this body, right, of this person. So the passport produces knowledge in order for bodies to be governed, particularly in particular spaces, right, namely border spaces, let's say. Which is what brings me to the sort of evidentiary function of the document, right? The document is only, such as a passport, only has relevance or is only activated in moments where there's a potential for dispute. If I'm trying to cross a border space, right, and I don't have a passport, and having a passport is the normative situation. Not having a passport is considered unusual in such spaces. The passport functions as a piece of evidence to prove that I have the right to traverse this border space, right? And so in this scenario, what you're imagining most likely is me with a passport or somebody with a passport, and a person behind the counter probably has a gun. And this relationship is mediated or triangulated, right, by the passport. This person who has a gun is the authority figure, of course. But Gittleman also talks about the way in which printedness and the sort of the substrate and the materiality of the passport also, right, signals authority. Another thinker that I think the document through is Johanna Drucker. And there's this passage or this phrasing from her book Graphesis, Visual Forms of Knowledge Production, that I find very useful. And it reads, most information visualizations are acts of interpretation masquerading as presentation. In other words, they are images that act as if they are just showing us what is, but in actuality, they are arguments made in graphical form. And in Graphesis, right, Drucker is talking about, information visualization, interfaces, and this kind of thing. But I think this phrasing can apply to any kind of visualization, including a document like a passport, which visualizes a right, right, a kind of a political right, a legal right. And this right, or this identity that's inscribed on the passport is a claim. It's an interpretation of subjectivity that's masquerading as presentation. So the point here is that, right, documents are also visualizations that are contingent, right, that are subject to contestation. Another thinker that I think the document through is a media theorist, film theorist named Jonathan Beller, who wrote a book called The Message is Murder, Substrates of Computational Capital. And in this book, he argues that information, this thing that we think of as being just sort of a matter of fact, information is not ontologically neutral. Information is rather constituted by the gaze that seeks it, reified in documentary formats, and can't be extracted from the capitalist logic of the commodity form, which violently transposes. In his example, he talks about the chicken coop, right? The chicken lives that enter another domain. He's talking about how, right, these complex lives of chickens, these beings, are reduced in the sort of managerial framework of the farmer to, right, numbers, biometrics, lifespans. I don't know much about chicken farming, but I'm sure there are a lot of sort of calculable variables, right, that inscribe the chicken into the domain of the farmer's managerial sort of, or what Beller would call the murderous managerial gaze. So in other words, information in its schematization of the world imposes claims that complex and thick lives are reducible to numbers which are combinable and comparable units available to the murderous rationality of managerial calculation. And then finally, the last way that I'll sort of, try to flesh out the document is through performance theorists, Diana Taylor's sort of counterposition of the archive and the repertoire, where she counterposes archival inscription, so things like documents, things that are written, things that I would say sit within the domain of, the interests of graphic design and as it's conventionally understood. So she counterposes these kinds of things to what she calls performatic ways of holding, of making and transmitting knowledge. So things that might be, you might understand as dance or song or ritual or performance, theater. Right, so there are ways of, there are forms of knowledge and knowledge transmission that are embodied and are enacted in situations that escape inscription or being recorded or documented to some extent. But she's careful not to figure, right, the archive and the repertoire as necessarily or absolutely or mutually exclusive or absolutely antagonistic to each other. But she is clear in her indictment of the document as a substrate of coloniality and an instrument of colonization. And I'll elaborate a little bit with an example that I often use to sort of charge the design of the document with its political dimension. So this is a screen capture from a video that went viral in 2014, I think, which shows a confrontation between some local kids in a public soccer field in San Francisco in the Mission District, and they're being confronted by a bunch of tech bros. So the local youth are mostly black and brown kids from the neighborhood, and the tech bros, I think they're all bros, they're all male presenting, mostly white and Asian. And there's this confrontation about who gets to play on the field. The tech bros show up and they say to these kids, you have to get off the field. We rented the field from 7:30 to 8:30 or whatever, something like this. And this older guy on the left, he's saying, that's ridiculous. This field has never been booked. The way that you play here is it's pickup. The rules that govern the space is pickup ball. You bring 7 people, we have 7 people, the winner stays on. But the tech bro is arguing, no, we pay $23 for this permit from the San Francisco Recreation and Parks Department, serial number, blah, blah, my name, it matches up, this is me, I have a legitimate claim to this space. And so, right, this scenario, I think, illustrates this sort of contrast or dissonance between these two ways of governing space. One, right, inscribed in the bodies and the memories and the practices of the local youth. Another inscribed on this sort of banal 8.5 by 11 document that you print from a website. So, right, the document is figured, I would say, in such instances as an instrument of colonization and coloniality, which is to say that, right, the document facilitates an understanding of that space as something that's governed by the San Francisco Parks and Recreation Department, not as something that's, you know, a form of governance that's known within the sort of bodies of the people that inhabit that space. So the grid, for instance, right, as a graphical artifact, as an artifact of documents, which is vaunted in graphic design history as an artifact of mid-20th century modernist reason, a progressive universalizing force against the pre-modern and arbitrary authority of kings and priests and the vagaries of nature. The grid is more contemptible when seen this way, right? When we remember that the grid as a graphical artifact appears in places like Turtle Island to parcelize land and render it fungible commodity, commensurable with units of money, knowable from the administrative gaze of the state, and makes the land exchangeable as property. The rights over which are defended by a monopoly of quote unquote legitimate violence of the colonial state, right? It's design, it's the graphic artifact, it's the property deed that does this, that enables this. I was going to sort of go into a thing about, anyway, I might skip this part, sorry. I'm realizing that time is going very fast. So, right, but the grid is this thing. This is an image of a plan for the Jeffersonian grid. The Jeffersonian grid is a plan to parcelize the territory of the United States implemented by Thomas Jefferson, who got these ideas, as far as I understand, while he was minister to France as part of the early American Revolutionary government, where he came across this idea to divide up the territories of France into a kind of like rational grid system like this, as a sort of like remedy to, in the French context, to the kind of overlapping jurisdictions of the church and local landlords and the sort of monarchical state. Right, which very much troubled the lower classes, you know, which was a condition of one of the grievances brought to the General Estates, which leads to the French Revolution. Right, so this idea of the grid in the French context is this sort of modern idea to do away with the sort of traditional divisions of governance, and so it doesn't, you know, play out in France actually, but Jefferson brings it to North America. Or to Turtle Island, and imposes this drawing on the space. And so, you know, for me, what's significant about this is this idea that's vaunted in design history as progressive and modern, right, and good, and, you know, tending towards a sort of this value of universality, can be seen in the context of this land as a kind of violent imposition premised on the document. So it's against these kinds of situations, a situation where graphics are mobilized to make space, make land knowable to a managerial gaze, to the gaze of a kind of colonial state, that I ask a couple of questions for a new kind of design, graphic design pedagogy. Do I have these here? No. I'll just read this quote, right, which I think is another way that I think through the document as being this thing that sediments memory, right? So the great enemy of property is oblivion, since the loss of conscious mastery over time and succession leads inevitably to the breakdown of property. Thus, the forces of oblivion are antagonistic to the self and property, while all the techniques of mnemonics are their essential allies, right? So documents being this thing again, sediments memory. The questions that I would ask of a new kind of design, graphic design pedagogy, would be, well, whose memory has graphic design reinforced, or whose memory are we being asked as sort of service providers to reinforce, and how might one refigure, right, the design pedagogy to be to ask the question of how to obliterate the colonial memory, the colonial forms of remembering. So for me, obliterating colonial memory isn't about decentering whiteness in design history, which what I'm referring to here is a document that went out recently, a big giant Google Doc called Decentering Whiteness in Design History. There was a big sort of Twitter shitstorm around it because all of the authors of this document were white design historians. You know, there's a lot of sort of like ethical acrobatics around it. I think they did good by addressing it. But anyway, my point is, right, actually, I don't think it's useful or helpful to decenter whiteness from design history. I think it might be more critical or more productive to actually, yes, center whiteness in design history, to the extent that whiteness can describe graphic design's entanglement with colonial and capitalism. And so just another example of the way in which I think that decentering whiteness misses the point is the way that diversified histories of design acknowledge, for instance, the precedents of a movable typography printing press in Asia and in Korea and Japan. This is all well and good. I have no real objection to this, except that what it tends to do is neglect a critical reckoning of the significance of the advent of movable typography in the European context, because it's the Gutenberg press, right? It's the European movable type printing press that enables the development of the stock certificate, right? The first of which was issued by the Dutch East India Company, making the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, the first publicly traded multinational corporation, and enabling really bold and adventurous colonial enterprises to mobilize capital and share financial risk in a very widely, because printing enables the production of thousands of stock certificates. And I'll elaborate on this a little bit in the exact examples that I'll show. But this capacity of the printing press to print stock certificates, right, also leads to the advent of the world's first stock exchange, and amplifies the expansionary capacities of capitalist enterprise. This is an image, a Dutch map of Lenapehoking in New York City. So this brings me to my project, Immutable. So Immutable is a project where I explore the document by making and reproducing them. Like I mentioned earlier, the designerly lens through which I view the document is focused by this notion of the imperative to immutability. It's led me to an understanding that the document as design object is shaped by what I've identified as 4 techniques of securitization against entropy, and against the entropy of movement through time, space, and against the political. And what I mean by that is doubt, contestation, dispute. So these sort of techniques fall under 4 headers. I call these headers clay, convention, coercion, and code. And so these headers are not necessarily meant to be descriptive, complete. They're not even meant to be discrete. I think some of the examples that I'll talk about, artifacts that I talk about, bleed between these categories. And I wouldn't even say that these categories are definite and indisputable, right? For me, they're more useful as a sort of way to frame this historiography that I'm proposing, which is a history of design, the design of documents. So this is a set of clay tablets that I made that make reference to 2 sort of ancient inscription technologies or techniques, one being, right, the clay tablet, the other being the cylinder seal. Maybe you remember from art history or, you know, world civilization class, the cylinder seal as this sort of thing that you roll across a clay document to seal it and you know, form a signature. Except here I'm sort of combining or sort of like spanning maybe 6,000 years of history, because what's pressed into these clay tablets is a 40-digit hash value. So a hash value is a kind of like cryptographic string that's generated by a cryptographic algorithm called SHA. Someone showed me how to do this once on my computer, but I forget how to do it. But I generated, you know, just a number of strings of 40 characters. And so what you see in this cylinder is a stack of disks that so I made this cipher of disks that where each alphanumeric value that can be part of cryptographic string. It has a different shape. And so I made the cylinder to press into clay. And the idea here being that clay is probably the most durable documentary substrate that we know of, right? This idea comes from this computer scientist whose blog I was reading at one point, and now it's down, so I can't cite him anymore. But he was sort of musing that, you know, we don't know that hard drives last more than 50 years, right? We just don't know what the longevity of digital storage is, but we do know that clay has lasted 5,000 years. So I took this idea to try to inscribe or he proposes this idea to try to inscribe data into clay substrates to store them, to guarantee their storage and integrity, right? Their immutability over millennia. Oh, I should say that these are images from I guess I would say a research-based exhibition that I presented in Buffalo at a space called El Museo a couple of years, a year and a half ago maybe. And so the walls are sort of display a lot of the research that I've done and some of the artifacts that I've made and sort of reference points that are significant to the research. So here are, on the left are, you see here an image of the Dutch, second oldest stock certificate, a reproduction of Mercator's map, some other references to this. This is, so I mean, one of the things that I was interested in doing in this activity is to reproduce documents, right? To try to just find as many high-res images as I could, or get access to as many high-res images as I could, to just sort of like go through the motions of reproducing documents, just to sort of contemplate or reflect on the significance of that activity. But in this case, this document is the second oldest existent stock certificate in the world. It's held in a little town called Hoorn in the Netherlands, and it's for the Dutch East India Company. And I think what's graphically significant about this is on the left-hand side is what you see is a typeset document with blank spaces, right? And the blank spaces imply that this document is being produced in multiples. So that the blank spaces can be filled in with a person's name, the sum of their investment, the percentage of their dividends, etc. And the implication here is that the Dutch East India Company made this financial innovation to allow the public, right, vast numbers of people to invest in a capitalist enterprise in order to spread the risk of this investment, but also enable much larger and much more ambitious colonial ventures. These are some images. This is a bit tangential, but these are a couple of images that go into some research that I've been doing into the history of metrication. My favorite piece in this project is this little weight, which is a standard kilogram weight, according to the National Institute of Standards something in the United States. But it's not this weight that I'm interested in. It's actually the certificate that I'm interested in, right? Because it's this certificate. This is the thing that certifies or, you know, makes the claim that this hunk of metal is actually 1 kilogram, right? The sort of value of this weight is indiscernible by human senses, maybe by even mechanical senses, right? Depends on the precision of your instrument. It's indiscernible, but actually, right, it's this statement of accuracy which reinforces the claim that this piece of metal is indeed 1 kilogram. On the right is a 3D milled 3D print of one of the last extant public meter sticks, which was issued by the French Revolutionary government in its efforts to standardize a system of weights and measures. So I scanned this and had it milled. Actually, this 3D print is 1/8 inch too large, but my scan is precisely 1 meter. This model, right, is bigger than 1 meter. Of course, it's the space between these two knobs, that's the meter, but I have a meter artifact within the 3D model file, right? So I'm just sort of interested in how, right, my 3D model here might serve as the standard which backs all other meters. Again, I'm interested in the way that a document like this meter stick can make the claim that it's a meter. And here I'm interested in the way that these kinds of claims require corroboration, right? Or the existence of a singular standard that's, in the case of the meter, was for a long time an actual stick that was protected in the suburbs of Paris at a place called the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, kept under a double vault. Just a couple other images, I'll skip these. I'll talk about this. So this is a coin that I had made, that I designed, and the three surfaces of this coin sort of speak to the three sort of forms of securitization that I talked about, techniques of securitization. Clay, when I say clay, I'm actually talking about materiality. Convention has to do, in some instances has to do with an appeal to authority, and coercion is another way, right, of securitizing a document. And so the three surfaces on this coin make reference to these three techniques. The first, the face of the coin is a replica or a copy of this, the sort of top of Hammurabi stele, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, right, as the one of the earliest extant examples of a systematized code of laws. But the picture at the top is significant is because it tells the story of, or it illustrates a scene where the king Hammurabi, who's the standing figure, receives a cord and a rod from the deity Shamash, who is the god of the sun, and also, from my understanding, the god of justice. The cord and the rod are significant because these are surveyor's tools, right? It's the sort of like measurement that sort of symbolizes justice. And the inscription, of course, I can't read cuneiform, so I'm conveying a scholar's interpretation. The inscription immediately below the illustration reads something to the effect of the laws that are outlined, the laws and punishments that are outlined below are not the invention of a human, a fallible human, but are rather passed down, right, to this realm by a deity, which is to say, in my understanding, you can't argue with these laws, right? They're inarguable. Their legitimacy is located outside of human subjectivity. There's a kind of appeal to authority, right? And so this establishes a kind of custom or convention as one way to protect the inscription, right, of like what constitutes a law and what's a just punishment for that crime, and what's a just punishment for that crime, to protect the legitimacy of those claims. And of course, right, the substrate itself makes the inscription immutable. The second, the sort of tails side of the coin, which reads, to counterfeit his death, is derived from these examples of American paper currency from the pre-revolutionary colonial, American Revolutionary era into the passing of the American Revolution. So these kinds of paper bills were printed by people like Benjamin Franklin as paper money to circulate in the colonies because of a shortage of bullion and precious metal currency. But printing has this particular vulnerability to overprinting, right? The person who controls the press might be tempted to enrich themselves by just printing a lot of money. And so one way to sort of protect the integrity of any paper money, to give confidence to its holder that it's not chasing value that doesn't actually exist in the economy. The money includes a death threat, right, to reinforce the system, the sort of like the claim that this is not an inflated currency. And then finally, the third surface of the coin is the edge of the coin, which the American and Canadian 25-cent coins and the dime, right, have this sort of milled edge, or what's called a reeded edge. of which there's an example here. This is actually a kind of scaleomorphic vestige. This design feature, a security feature, is a scaleomorphic vestige of a time when circulating coins were made out of precious metals like gold and silver, and there was a sort of a fraudulent practice called clipping, where people would shave the edge of coins so that the face value of let's say a silver coin was retained, but the actual metal content of the value of the coin would be reduced. And this was a crime that was severely punished because of the kind of extreme vulnerability of such documents to fraud. The punishment, I think, was equally severe. So the appearance of the reeded edge, establishes a kind of normative situation where the presence of it indicates that the coin contains its full metal content. If the edge of the coin was smooth, then you might suspect fraud, right? You might suspect that you're not getting your the full face value. And this technique of reeded edges was perfected by a person named Matthew Bolton. The image, his portrait is on the left side of this 50-pound note, British 50-pound note. And Bolton was a business partner of James Watt, who was the inventor of the steam engine. And one of the sort of primary uses, besides pumping water out of mines for the steam engine, was before even it was the steam engine was widely used in factories, was minting coinage. And so I just bring that in as a little bit of a tangent, because a lot of these narratives, like I was mentioning, have these tangents associated with them, like metrication. There's another tangent that I go into about musical notation, but all of these are tangents that I bring into the story as a way to flesh out some concepts like standardization. Well, that's maybe one of the main ones, right? That I think are not very well addressed in design, in graphic design pedagogy, but I think are highly consequential because of the sort of political dimension of standardization. Okay, I won't go into that here. I realize I'm almost at an hour. But what I want to do here is, what I want to say here is that my aim in centering the sort of colonial and capitalist entanglements of design, of graphic design with the document, it's not so much to argue for a pedagogy and a kind of disciplinary imaginary that's about, trying to design passports, trying to design money, trying to design things that are, better passports or better money, things that are sort of design artifacts that are used in the course of in administrating and governing people, but rather it's to concretely identify an enemy against which to struggle, right? I want to identify, I want to sort of, center this stuff as the thing against which a different kind of design pedagogy might cast itself. Right, so my intention is to suggest that a historiography of design which narrates design's role in the reproduction of colonial and capitalist memory begs the question of how to remember differently, and perhaps even calls for perhaps even the abandonment of design as a useful sort of disciplinary framework for asking these questions. And so at the very least, in my mind, this would be a mandate for a new, an open field of study. And I'm bringing in this quote here that I came across on Twitter by the user named EJ Lordy, which reads, "I once heard Gayatri Spivak describe an academic field as a field of vision. It's not about who and what you train yourself to see and look for and listen to. So the field is not an object or a terrain that one masters, but a mode of seeking in the world that one cultivates endlessly." Another way that I might think about this, new approach to design pedagogy, or perhaps the dissolution of design pedagogy, is through this idea of studying up, which I learned about from an anthropologist named Laura Nader, who argues in this essay in the 70s that anthropology knows a lot about oppressed people. It knows a lot about working class people. It knows a lot about colonized people, because as scholars who have a relative position of privilege, they have access to these constituencies. But what what anthropology knows very little about are people in power, right? Because those are the sites, in spite of our relative privilege in the academy, these are sites that we have very little access to, right? And so what she's calling for is a kind of mandate in anthropology to study up, right? To study those in power, and to try to discover or invent techniques for doing this, right? For accessing these spaces and deriving knowledge from them. Another person that I think this new kind of pedagogy, the possibilities of this new pedagogy through is Paolo Freidi, whose concept of naming the world as part of the vocation of humanization gives the word design, which is part of the word designation, a more critical charge. I like this idea of naming the world, right? Or like bringing names to the world or reviving names to the world as a way to sort of counterpose colonial and capitalist memory. So I ask things like, yeah, how can design be oriented towards studying, exploring, and creating other ways of remembering? Could historiography, right, be about designing history? And does that involve new kinds of writing, transmission, storage, retrieval, and performance, right? Could design actually be about historiography? And can historiography mean, how do we design history? How do we design memory? And at what point is it even useful to retain design as a disciplinary framework? And at what point must its institutional and professional horizons be abandoned to meaningfully explore these questions? And to echo Ruth, the geographer, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's formulation of prison abolition, which is, you know, to paraphrase it very severely, which is this idea of prison abolition, not necessarily as the negation of the prison, but the cultivation of a world in which prisons are unnecessary. I sort of model that with respect to the degree, with the difference of urgency. I model, right, I take that as a model for asking, can an abolitionist approach to design pedagogy affirm and amplify existing non-oppressive ways of knowing and being, but also be tasked with exploring and giving form to radically divergent ones, right? What would this look like, or would it look like anything, right? Is it even a question, you know, does it retain the sort of like ocular-centric prioritization of graphic design? Or could it be something else maybe more akin to, right? Can designers charged with thinking about how to remember things differently take on the idea of the performatic and explore their vocation that way? So those are the kinds of questions I'm asking, and I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you so much, Chris, for that. It's lots of great digressions in there that I'm sure a lot of us probably would love to follow up on. I think we had discussed, maybe I'd ask a few kind of opening questions to get the ball rolling. I'll moderate some questions from the audience, which I'd love to hear from. Always nice, of course, to hear people ask the question verbally or spatially on the image, but if you can't, then we'll also take questions in the chat. We'll try to sort out those few things. To just kind of maybe recap, because the lecture was covering so much material and really fascinating. You set up at the beginning this kind of Lisa Gittleman's kind of theory of the document within a system, right? Like the self and the other, and that triangulation you talk about, in the sense that a document only exists as in a system, as in there's that French librarian who talks about a gazelle in the wild is not a document, but a gazelle in a zoo is a document.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think it's a really good standing triangulation to understand subjectivity and interpretation, almost this kind of semiotic triangle to a certain degree of understanding how a document functions or a sign functions and its power structure. And then you went on for the first half of the lecture to talk about the colonial structures of and power structures of the function of the document. And the one with the football was a really, I've never heard that example before of this kind of techno aspect with regards to a very simple square piece of real estate versus tradition and use, street kind of use. And then so you kind of critiqued all of that and kind of almost set up this aspect that the document has perpetuated and supported as an ally, to use a term from one of your quotes, an ally to the sustaining of the violence of these colonial systems. And then the second half, which dived into a little more your research with your exhibition and what you're personally interested in, was looking at standardization and looked at how design utilizes strategies, graphic strategies, and so forth to create a lineage of time in a certain sense, like counterfeiting, the stability, the standard, and so on and so forth. So it's readable. And that kind of almost seemed like an antithesis to the first half. It almost seemed like the document sustained violence, and then the second half was an interest in the research of how the document is successful as a sustaining time aspect. And I'm wondering how you can, and I think at the end you were trying to piece those together of these possible modes of pedagogy and design. I'm just wondering if you could maybe talk a bit about that, as in our strategies. Maybe I guess I'm saying the end quotes were very imaginative, but I'm wondering if you could kind of bring it down a little bit more in terms I can understand, or layman terms, of how or what that tension plays out for you as a designer, in the regards to, does the document something that you want to create that can be read 100 years, 50 years from now, 10 years from now? Because there was this one moment where you said about the coins, or no, it was the clay tablets. Oh, there was this really great guy on a blog, but now the blog is down, so I can't cite him. And so it was almost this meta moment in exercising the talk where you were like, whoa, a guy did something on a blog, which is totally not a document. It's a transient moment. And now he's gone, so I can't cite him. I can't use him and continue that lineage of intellectual work because it's evaporated. And at that moment of talking with the clay, I don't know if you did that on purpose or not, but it kind of happened. And so I'm wondering, as a designer, how you navigate those two tensions you bring up in the talk.
So I mean, the first thing that I would say is that, like, typically when this is my practice and my, my experience, but typically, like, I've never been commissioned to design anything with the mind to it having a kind of documentary function. Primarily, it's like a publicity function, and incidentally, it becomes a document, like your kind of gazelle example, right? The way that it's framed and the sort of bureaucracies within which these artifacts circulate constitute it as a document. And Gittleman talks about the way that the document itself is constitutive of the bureaucracy, right? These things are sort of like co-constitutive. So, like, one of the tensions is that, like, I've never really intended to design a document, and it gone into the world, or I mean, at least as a designer, I've never been commissioned with that as, like, the mandate. The tension that you speak about, I mean, particularly around that example of, I'm not sure if I'm going to address your question in the way that you meant it, but the example of the blog and the computer scientist and his sort of idea, that wasn't intentional, but I'm glad that you brought that up, because yeah, I mean, I think, there are sort of like points of view about sort of institutional academic knowledge production and the sort of like colonial dimension of the university, that some would argue, right, in its structure, excludes, like, ways of knowing and being, and knowledge transmission that escape or resist certain kinds of inscription and like archiving and citation, right? And so one of the things, again, I don't know if I'm addressing your question, but one of the things that I think about is, like, maybe I should just, as part of this whole idea of, like, resisting the document, maybe I should just plagiarize everything and not cite people and screw this whole fetish of citation, as if the only people that produce knowledge are the people that make marks within university libraries, that end up in university libraries. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I addressed your question. If you want to follow up, yeah.
Yeah, in a way it is. I guess I'm asking for how you would navigate these beyond a theoretical framework of an imagination or a speculation or a theoretical academic idea of decentering, as you say, or not decentering. I was curious of some design strategies that you would implement. And so the counter or the lack of citing is kind of interesting, almost in this, hierarchy, you know, in a
Yeah.
sense like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this design scholar named Mahmoud Keshavarz, who wrote a book called The Design Politics of the Passport, and he has a chapter in it about the passport counterfeiter, right? And sort of like essentially asking like, why is this person not considered a designer, right? And so, you know, one of the things that I would, you know, write into my curriculum is a sort of minor on counterfeiting, right? Like how, if design can be oriented towards, you know, undoing like the system, the colonial system of borders and nation states, maybe like a design pedagogy that includes counterfeiting, a minor in counterfeiting, let's say, could be one of the things to include in the curriculum. Another thing might be document destruction, right? Like how do we resist you know, the sort of police surveillance by working to find ways to destroy or scramble documents, right, so that they become useless, or making so many counterfeits that no one knows, right, where the legitimate ones start and the counterfeits end. Like these kinds of questions might be questions for of something to study, right? You won't get a job out of this, maybe, I don't think, unless you know, unless the Communist Party or some whatever has a big strike fund that they're willing to pay designers to, you know, to work these things out or whatever.
There's actually, I mean, for counterintelligence, the show I curated a few years ago on the overlap of art and military, one of the works, and actually the typeface design for the show graphically, was by Sung Moon, who was an NSA technician in Korea for a while, and then left to become a graphic designer. And he actually created a typeface that was tried to be unreadable by machines, like optical recognition. It's called ZXX. And it was literally trying to jam the computer optical system for humans to read it, but not like a surveillance system to read it. And this idea of reading, or later on in the show, counterfeit as well, was really important to trying to understand those strategies. I want to kind of push this one crazy moment later. You don't have to answer this one, but Peter Gallison, the philosopher, science historian, he wrote this essay once about several years ago about the amount of classified information that's generated, and that it actually completely dwarfs peer review. So the amount of material that's published in universities and so forth that's public is completely overwhelmed and doesn't even compare to the amount that are classified documents. And he was looking at that on a scalar aspect that was exponentially growing. And you know, we as a public only have access to those often through redacted documents. A lot of these things, you know, it's very well known, these black stripes, right, to block out information. And I'm wondering if what would this framework be about in regards to classified, the document that wasn't open, but the document that was supposed to remain classified? Would there be an interesting design premise to deal with that as a strange environment, as a strange client, or to take it to what we're saying, to subvert that, to say, hey, how do we overcome a design that's built for classified strategies? Or so either you know, pick a team. I'm curious.
Yeah, well, the team that I would pick would be, you know, the people who would typically be the subject of that kind of surveillance and policing, right? Like in terms of like redaction or you know, like obliterating certain forms of remembering, like those are techniques that, you know, I think would be cool to include in a design curriculum. That's about like how to hide, right? How to scramble, how to evade. I mean, you know, but the other thing that I want to say about this is that kind of going to something that you mentioned earlier about, like, you know, how these documents use design techniques. I would rather see, I'm more interested in seeing it the other way, and looking at like accounting, for example, or governance, or, you know, starting a corporation or something like these sorts of activities as a form of design agency. that accounts, right, for the kind of systemic dimension of the artifact, or like the kind of co-constitutive status of like the document and the bureaucracy within it, which it circulates, right? Like I'm not, you know, like when I'm talking about designing documents, it also means designing bureaucracies, except I don't want to design bureaucracy. You know what I mean? I'm talking about the sort of like that relationship there. So, you know, if one is designing tasked with, or like looking for ways to design other ways of remembering, you know, the names of the land, then, you know, what's the sort of like cultural, let's say, system within which those names continue to circulate, you know, beyond, you know, that maybe outlives paper and hard drives. You know, this is a sort of like a question maybe that this kind of curriculum might ask, or study might ask.
We have a question from Shani trying to follow this up, or at least address Laura. Do you want to ask your question, Shani?
Sure. Hi,
Shani.
Chris. I was curious as to whether Laura Nader offers any strategies for studying up, i.e. accessing the spaces of those who would likely prefer not to be studied, aside from joining the NSA. So just, you know, does she actually offer?
In that text, it's like a journal article, so it doesn't really you know, elaborate a lot, but I think that kind of question is precisely, you know, like for me, resonant with that Spivak quote, right, about how an academic field is, how did you say it again? Right, an academic field is a field of vision. It's about how and who you and what you train yourself to see. Right, it's a kind of like open question. I don't think it's a thing that's precisely because it's asking for something that's difficult to do. There aren't a lot of precedents for.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps there are, but maybe it depends on where we look. Again, maybe we ought to be looking towards counterfeiters, right? To understand a mastery of you know, studying up, right? A counterfeiter must master the techniques of securitized printing, right?
Right.
To do what
Yeah. I'm loving, I mean, you know, I love the theory, but you know me, I want the practice. I want the practical. So, but that's maybe what we're being asked to think about is how to actually, okay.
Yeah.
That was my question. Thanks.
Like, again, I think about counterfeiters, but I also, you know, think about historically, like people who've destroyed documents. David Graeber, who just passed away recently, right? One of the things that he talks about is how, you know, in every revolution, social, political revolution, what you find is a massive destruction of documents, right? Debt records, criminal records, you know, surveillance documents in East Germany, etc. This is like one of the, you know, documents have this sort of consequentiality, right?
Right.
So like, can we think about that as part of this curriculum? I'm risking, by saying this kind of thing, like just totally dissolving any kind of, you know, meaningful disciplinary boundary, but who cares? You know?
Great, we got some questions rolling in here. So we have one from Nicole. It says, what are your thoughts on the increasing dematerialization of the documents, i.e. the Bitcoin?
So, well, I have a friend who's a sort of scholar of cryptocurrencies, and he shared an insight with me that, you know, that I think is quite useful, which is that even things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are not dematerialized, right? They're sort of contingent on a vast network of like data centers and submarine, you know, cables and, you know, and like the network of things that fuel and power those spaces. So there is very much a kind of like material basis to even things like cryptocurrency. But I think I understand the point of the question. And Bitcoin sort of figures into the narrative of immutability that I have as well, which in the sense that the blockchain, which is this distributed ledger. Like I have a sort of tangent that I didn't go into on double entry bookkeeping, and which is this accounting technique where you have two, well, if you, maybe you know double entry bookkeeping. I feel like I'm going to fumble the description, but it's like where you have like, where if you take money in, you have to minus it in one column. If you add money in a column, you have to minus it in the other column. So it's this way of like having a checks and balances to your record keeping. The blockchain is this sort of like networking of this, where you have, I'm sorry if I'm explaining something you already know, but right, it's where you have a distributed ledger where the record of a transaction is distributed across a network, of computers, which is for all, practical purposes, immutable, because you can't, if you were to try to change a transaction, the record of a transaction, you'd have to change it on every single computer in the network in order for that change to become valid, right? And so it's the sort of the distributed nature of the network that makes it effectively impossible. There's this thing called the 51% rule, which I won't go into, but effectively it's impossible to change the record. So like the increasing dematerialization of documents, like in systems like the Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, I think of as kind of shitty, because effectively what it means is that, like, if the blockchain were used to record a criminal record or any kind of like, thing that you don't want people to know about, or like a criminal record which can be erased in sort of traditional forms or whatever, document formats. You can't erase a criminal record. You can't erase debt on the blockchain. It's there forever, right? Effectively. And so basically, there's this scholar named David Columbia, who's a sort of English comp sci guy, who writes about the way, he thinks that blockchain is a sort of fascist technology, right? It inscribes irrevocably records of debt, decision-making claims that might otherwise be disputable and overturnable through some kind of revolutionary eruption, right? It precludes all of that. And so, yeah, the dematerialization of the document, I think, is a sort of scary prospect if it's on the blockchain.
Could I add? Hi, anyways, haven't seen you in so long. It's so
Yeah.
nice to see you. So to add to that, because I agree, it is a fascist system that's terrifying. I mean, you brought up, the invention of, passports to control borders, where essentially, with the rise of a capitalist system, obviously it meant the rise of individuals, and documents was a way to do that. So if we're in a world where there's systems like biometrics and face recognition technology, I'm just curious, because I know that your history sort of deals with like real tangible objects, like the clay tablets and coins. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of like how graphic design, if we can call it that, I know like perhaps that's a term we want to get rid of, how design figures into those systems of like control. Since we're, you've got documents, but this is a kind of a different kind of document that gets stored on a server and in ones and zeros.
So, I mean, the way I respond to that might be indirect, actually, but like facial recognition technology, these kinds of sort of forms of like visual knowledge production that have to do with policing and surveillance, right? These are not things, right, as you probably would guess, that are part of, what a designer imagines to be part of their practice or their domain, right? Or things that they even care about as part of their practice. Maybe care about it in other ways, but I would be interested in sort of like, considering those things through, what I mentioned before as a designerly lens, which in my mind means like, let's explore understanding these things. Let's study these things up by trying to make them, right? Or trying to engage in forms of like knowledge production that have to do with surveillance. Like I give, I've done classes where I give students the assignment of like designing a passport. And we sort of like kind of you know, the designs, is like, let's say it's a sophomore class. The design is like whatever, it's sort of like sophomoric. But what's interesting about this assignment is sort of like working through and thinking through like, okay, how do we game this design? Like, how do we fraudulently, you know, so which is to say, like, how do we protect this against, you know, criminals, right? Then we talk about criminality. Then we talk about, right, the sort of like how this document sort of figures the line between, you know, an illegal person and a legal person, right? So the bringing design to this conversation isn't so much about like how do we design these things necessarily. It's about like how do we understand how like, you know, a visual practice is mobilized to like, you know, violate people.
Right, like enable systems of power in a way that looks objective and dispassionate, but isn't.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I just have one last question. I'm so sorry. Just one last question, because I am super interested in this issue of the historiography of graphic design. And because right now I'm just studying art history, which is related, but design, I think it's its own thing. I'm just curious, like how, like when did the term become official? Like when did it officially become institutionalized, and when were people like recognized as graphic designers? Because I imagine it's super recent, right? Like it's not a
Yeah.
new
Supposedly
thing.
it can be located to the 20s, I think. I'm not quite sure, but there was a designer, self-styled designer named, oh geez, something Dwiggins, yeah, someone just wrote it. Oh, hi, Aggie. uh, 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 and I think what Dwiggins was trying to do was differentiate the practice of, you know, the profession of graphic design from as a sort of like, you know, almost managerial intellectual practice, distinguish that from like typesetting and lithography, right? And so the designer is the person that sort of like orchestrates, right? And there, I think, I'm glad you brought that up, because there already you see this sort of like resonance with design and the sort of like managerial, you know, managerial operations, managerial practices, or like a managerial conceit, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a question from BJ asking about if you drew upon the utopia of rules by government.
Yeah. I mean, one thing, now that you mentioned that, one thing that it sticks out for me as a kind of like useful idea from Grayburn, that in one of the chapters of that book is the way he describes cops as bureaucrats with guns, right? I mean, if you think like I think Graeber also talks about this, right? Like if you look at if you watch any police drama, there's always this sort of like complaint from the cops about how much paper they have to push around, right? And I think that illustrates very, you know, very clearly or very poignantly the sort of like violent dimension, right? That's just underneath the surface of that 8.5 by 11 sheet. Like that example in the in the Mission District with the soccer field, right? If someone there were to call in a state authority to adjudicate that dispute, right, they would probably call a cop. The cop is going to stand behind the person with the paper, not, you know, not. I mean, one would imagine, right? One could plausibly, this was a very plausible scenario, I would say, that the cop is going to back up the document and not so much like the kids with their sort of like made up rules or whatever. So that's an idea that's for me comes to mind immediately when you mentioned utopia rules. But yeah, certainly, right? Like I think there's another essay that I wrote recently for a magazine by a colleague in Chicago that I called The Banality of Excel. And it's sort of like a bunch of notes on the grid as a sort of like artifact. There's graphical artifact that's charged in the examples that I use, at least, right? That's charged with facilitating governance, surveillance, for privileging the sort of like the visuality and the document as a sort of instrument of governance. but yeah, some of these ideas sort of come from, right, the Graeber's Utopia of Rules, but also James C. Scott's The Art of Not Being Governed, and sort of his work about like legibility. Right? I'm interested in, I didn't mention him in this talk, but I'm also very interested in James Scott's sort of account of the emergence of the state in Southeast Asia. And he actually has a new book, a relatively new book out called Against the Grain, which I think is sort of like, you know, he accounts for the prevalence of grains in global diets like rice, wheat, corn. He attributes this to the fact that these crops are highly legible, and so they were their cultivation was encouraged or incentivized by early states because they grew above ground, and because they grew above ground, they were legible, right, to tax surveyors. And in the art of taxation, what one wants to do is to not overtax or overburden your subject population, because what that leads to is either rebellion or flight. And right, so a very legible crop, which is scientifically manageable, is more consistent with the aims, right, of designing a state. And so there's a kind of like, and this is the sort of like condition around which, right, like you get things like property and like laws and, you know, policing. I'm compressing and paraphrasing thousands of years of and a globe of history, but I hope you understand my point.
Great. We wanted to kind of wrap it up by about 7. So if there's one more question out there, that'd be great to hear from it if there's anyone. In the meantime, while we maybe wait for one question, if it'll pop up or not, I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about the stock certificate and the press. I mean, when I lecture on the history of visual studies and art, I'm always looking at the coin, which brought up as the first example of, let's say, images reproduced as the actual reproduction
right,
mechanically. And actually, it's in the stamped coins from 400 that we actually get minted images, and it's interesting to see that actually the first reproduction images is on a monetary circulatory system. And so, and then, you know, I kind of usually fast forward to the Gutenberg press and then talk about more religion and theology and politics, state politics, not stock. So when you mentioned that, it really kind of got me interested, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, of the connection in that Gutenberg movable type press and the stock certificates.
Yeah. So just to zoom out for a second, the thing that I didn't mention about this Immutable project is that the sort of like initial push, like the trajectory that I'm trying to trace, is one that like narrates the sort of co-terminal relationship between money and writing. And this is sort of like inspired. This is inspired by this anthropologist named Keith Hart, who was kind of a mentor of Graeber, actually. Who wrote this book called The Memory Bank, which is about the sort of like, again, the kind of co-terminal relationship between money and writing as forms of like, inscribing and transmitting memory through time and space. So yeah, this relationship between money and writing sort of pops up, and it starts, as you mentioned, at the very beginning with the sort of like the repeated image. Or, I mean, I would say that it even starts with clay, right? Like, I'm thinking about how clay tablets, how writing, right, is not invented to inscribe like literary expression, but writing was invented as a tool of accounting, right? The first forms of writing, at least as, you know, the examples in Mesopotamia demonstrate, right? Those were documents that inscribed like contracts, receipts, obligations, and this kind of thing. And the kinds of information that were inscribed, again, were not like sentiments or you know, poetic expression or literary expression. There were numbers. You know, there were things that could be counted: days, commodities, you know, like bodies, this kind of thing. Actually, this image here, right, is alleged to be it's from a cylinder seal. It's understood to be an image of people doing some accounting with sticks. Anyway, this sort of like relationship between writing and money is kind of flows throughout this narrative. And it's the same with the printing press, right? Like in the European context, the techniques, the technologies that get assembled into what becomes the movable type printing press, you know, there's the screw is one thing, which, you know, has a lot of, you know, functions. But the main one, like the movable type part, comes from metallurgy, from metalworking, right? Like the knowledge and the skill of metalworkers, goldsmiths. Gutenberg was a goldsmith. That sort of like intellect assembled into the machine comes from, right, is sort of passed on from this tradition of like striking forms into metal. So a part of my research, what I took some lessons in punch cutting. So I like learned how to cut. Well, I mean, very poorly, but I learned what's involved in cutting metal typography. What was my point? Oh yeah, so the religious aspect. So there's this historian of print that I refer to named S.H. Steinberg, who has this book called 500 Years of Printing, I think. And in it, he also makes this observation that that the significance of Gutenberg's printing press didn't lie so much with, right, the 42, is it the 42 line Bible, right, and the kind of explosion of like literacy. He argues that it has more to do with the job printing that Gutenberg did, right, which is the printing jobs that he did for money, right? Like, so he printed calendars, he printed certificates. In particular, he was commissioned to print indulgences from the Catholic Church, right? These documents that the faithful could buy to absolve themselves of a sin or to certify that they had done a good thing for the community, right? These certificates, this is how Gutenberg made his money. He doesn't quite make this leap, and this is a leap that I kind of make, and I'm kind of working on piecing it together very slowly. But this, to me, is a kind of precursor to the stock certificate, right? This sort of like production of certificates and documents, if not directly if not having a direct lineage, at least like technically prefigures the stock certificate, and also paper money, of course. And then, right, with the advent of these sort of new technologies of document production, you get all these new kinds of problems of like security and securitization. And so there are sort of other tangents that sort of deal with that. But to be honest, this story is like all over the place. There's like a lot of stuff going on.
No, I mean, that makes a lot of great sense. I mean, and exactly that the stocks is a fragment of a greater whole. And then not only you say the distributing liability, but also, you know, same thing with insurance issues of distributing risk in order to subsidize these colonial ventures through stocks and insurance. So that's kind of super fascinating. We'll have to pick it up a little bit more. There's so many tangents, as you said, in that research project. I want to thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time to do this talk. I mean, it's funny, we don't have a graphic design department here at Daniels.
Oh, that's an idea.
So it's great we could bring you in through the art program. And I know that your research just brings together a lot of people from the architecture side, the landscape side, and so forth, all the design fields here that we do have. And I know our students really are into making publications, and your work has been really influential. So it's great to have you come and speak. And I know they're really looking forward to meeting up with you in the studio. So again, thank you so much. If we can just give, I guess, a virtual applause for Chris.